For more than 2 decades, Vladimir Putin has built a system where wealth and political power are closely intertwined. But what happens to the businessmen who once stood at the heart of Russia's economy and then found themselves on the wrong side of the Kremlin? Martin Sixsmith was the BBC's correspondent in Moscow for many years. In his new book, Suing the Kremlin, The Battle for Putin's Billions, he explores the story of the oligarchs, the fortunes that were seized, and the extraordinary legal battle to recover billions from the Russian state. I'm delighted to say that Martin Sixsmith joins me now.
Good morning, Ed.
Welcome to the show, Martin. Tell us why you wanted to write this book. I mean, you were obviously the Moscow correspondent for many years, so you would have seen these people make their fortunes in the sort of wild west that Russia became after the Berlin Wall fell, and you would have seen Putin coming to power.
I was there in the 1990s when the oligarchs, as we now know them, got very rich. Under the Soviet Union, private enterprise was banned, of course, but then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and suddenly there was this rush into private enterprise, into money-making, and a small group of people, we know Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Roman Abramovich, and those sort of people earned a lot of money. And by the mid-1990s, after Boris Yeltsin had sold off all the crown jewels of state industry to these people, Boris Berezovsky said that 7 oligarchs, owned 50% of the Russian economy.
And so what happened then? Because Putin comes into power, and, I'm old enough to remember when Putin first rose to prominence in Russia, and there were a huge, there was great optimism about him. He appeared to be, a man who would embrace democracy and take Russia even further forward, as it were, in terms of being Western orientated. When did he start to kind of assert his power over the oligarchs?
Quite early on. The problem was that the oligarchs in the 1990s didn't just want massive wealth, which they got. They also wanted political power. So by the end of the 1990s, the oligarchs were essentially running the government. Boris Yeltsin had become a sort of puppet of these very rich men. And Boris Berezovsky in particular said that he was the power behind the throne. So when Putin came to power in 2000, he didn't like the look of that. But as you say, at the beginning, he was still sort of signed up to the Western system of, free market liberal democracy. So he didn't move against the oligarchs immediately. It was absolutely sort of Shakespearean style drama.
Yes, give us a little insight into how it occurred, because it would occur to me that the oligarchs had all the power, and if Putin was going to move against them, they to a certain extent held all the cards. How did Putin outmaneuver them?
Well, initially he said, "Look, I'll offer you a deal. If you keep me, essentially, the president, you can keep your wealth." And for a while that worked, and some of them did sign up for that bargain. Roman Abramovich, Potanin, and a couple of others took Putin's advice. They stayed out of politics, and they kept their wealth. But some of the others, the really powerful oligarchs, didn't like the way Putin was treating them. They thought that he was being very dismissive towards them. He wasn't giving them the respect that they thought they were due. So Boris Berezovsky, for instance, railed against Putin. He used his television station to criticize Putin. And quite early on in 2000, Putin drove him out of the country. Berezovsky ended up in London. He continued to criticize Putin. He continued to call for a revolution to overthrow Putin. And then in 2013, he was found noose around his no suspicious circumstances. The other person who really stood up against Putin, and this is the sort of clash at the heart of my Khodorkovsky, and he's the man who owned a controlling stake in Russia's biggest oil company, Yukos. And by the early 2000s, he was the richest man in Russia. He's also a great philanthropist. He was sort of in the mold of Bill Gates. And initially, he and Putin got on okay. But by 2003, the tensions were starting between them. And Khodorkovsky very boldly, or very foolishly, whichever way you look at it, went on national television, a meeting at which he accused Putin of being corrupt. And that was in February 2003. And then by October 2003, he was under arrest. and Putin brought him back to Russia, to Moscow, and he spent the next 10 years in a Russian labor camp.
And he's now been released, and I think is in the West. And in fact, he tweets regularly about Putin and the war on Ukraine. I mean, Putin is a ruthless man. Why did he let these people go?
Well, times were different back then. For the first part of his time in power, Putin still was courting the West. He wanted Russia to be part of the international economic system, and he knew that Russia relied on Western investors. So he didn't initially want to be seen as the man who confiscates private wealth, private companies. Khodorkovsky was released in 2013. It was before, with the Sochi Olympics coming up, Putin really didn't want this sort of hanging over his reputation. So Khodorkovsky was released. He came eventually to London. He lives in London now. I know him quite well. And it's his successors, the people who took over the remnants of Yukos, who've waged this long-running legal battle, getting on for 20 years, to reclaim the wealth that they say that Putin stole from the company. And just at the end of last year, that legal process reached a conclusion, and they got a judgment in their favour at the International Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague for $50 billion against the Kremlin. That's the largest, by far, award ever made.
Yeah, this is absolutely at the heart of your book, this extraordinary case that has gone on for 20 years in the international courts to get a judgment against Putin. But obviously what shines through in that is, to the reader, is a sense that this is a completely futile exercise. So what drove them on to do this? Because Putin is never going to pay this $50 billion. He'll just ignore the judgment.
Well, interestingly, the Kremlin didn't ignore the legal proceedings. They, way back in 2005, when they all started, they could have suggested, "Oh, we don't want anything to do with it. We're not going to engage with it. Get lost." But they didn't. They sent legions of lawyers to argue these cases. They argued at every turn about liability, about jurisdiction, about the merits of the case. They spent hundreds of thousands, probably millions, on big American lawyers to argue the case, and they went all the way through to the end of last year, as I say, when the final judgment was delivered, this $50 billion. As for paying it, when the case started, as I say, Russia was still sort of part of this system and still wanted to be seen to be respecting its international obligations. By 2025, last year, when the judgment came in, they were already 3 years and more into their war against Ukraine, and the Kremlin just didn't care anymore about what people thought about them, about what the international community thought about them. So, as you say, they refused to pay the recourse. If the judgment is brought in against a state, in this case Russia, they can then seize the assets of that state abroad, in different countries abroad. And that's what they've started to do now. So recently they seized the Stolichная and the Moskovskaya vodka brands, which they then sold on, and they made several million out of that. But it's a long way from several million to 50 billion, so there's a long road ahead.
And so, I mean, this is interesting. So when they seize these assets abroad, what is the Kremlin's reaction? Because the Kremlin will regard it as seizing effectively government property. What are the diplomatic repercussions for that?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the Kremlin argued all the way through. They lost the Stolichная Moskovskaya vodka brand cases. But in terms of repercussions, effort to sue the Kremlin for 20 years. They've been threatened. They've had international arrest warrants issued against them. Some of the Russians involved in it ended up in jail, ended up dying in jail. And when Yukos was dismantled in the early 2000s, the company was taken, the remnant company was taken over by a British lawyer, a man called Stephen Curtis, who in 2004 sensed that he was being followed. And he wrote to his father and he said that if anything happens to me in the next 2 weeks, it won't be an accident. And within a week, he'd been in a helicopter crash and he died in that helicopter crash. So there's all sorts of pressure which is being brought against the people who are suing the Kremlin. And, they've withstood it. They've brought the case to a conclusion and they've got the judgment.
I mean, this is a dangerous work, Martin. I mean, even you must feel slightly nervous writing and publishing a book like this. Mikhail Khodorkovsky presumably feels nervous all day.
Well, he doesn't. I mean, I've worked with him on a sort of an ongoing basis, and he lives in London. The address of his office is listed in the phone book. You go to the office, you press a bell, and the door opens. And I've said to him, are you not worried about this? And he said, well, look, I served my time in jail. If Putin wanted to get me, he'd get me. So I'm not going to let it impinge on my life. I'm going to carry on living my life. I'm going to live it, the way I want to do it, and I'm not going to let it bring me down. I do have to say, I'm very wary about touching the doorknob of his office now, because the Novichok experience in Salisbury just make you sort of a bit worried about that.
What is the relationship between the sort of oligarchs? You've got Khodorkovsky, who's an exile and taking on Putin, and you've got Abramovich, who effectively did a deal with Putin, which seems to have ensured his survival. So how do they kind of relate to each other?
When the oligarchs were dispossessed by Putin, there was a lot of infighting. So Berezovsky and Abramovich had been partners. They'd owned the massive Sixsmith oil corporation in Russia, but they fell out in a very big way. And they squabbled and they sued each other in the courts. In fact, it came to judgment in London. Berezovsky was trying to claim tens of millions back from Abramovich, but the court ruled in Abramovich's favour. And, that was a great blow to Berezovsky. So that wasn't a happy relationship. Khodorkovsky now, as you say, is sort of a big figure in the anti-Putin democratic opposition in exile. But he is in exile, and it's very hard to change things when you're all those miles away from Russia.
And just finally, the oligarchs that have survived, as it were, with the war in Ukraine, one reads constant speculation in the press about how people are reacting to Putin continuing to prosecute the war, and potential speculation that people will try and bring him down. I mean, are the oligarchs who've remained completely neutered, or do they potentially have a say in Putin's future?
They have a say in the sense that they're sort of trying to foment opposition to him. Abramovich has a say in that he still has the ear of Putin. He initially served as a bit of a mediator in the Ukraine talks. But the problem is that Putin has gone so far down the road of he's tied his whole political standing to bringing home success from the war in Ukraine, that that's not going to happen immediately. As for whether he's in danger of being overthrown, okay, the economy is really suffering, inflation is roaring.
It wasn't the best line with Martin Sixsmith, and I think it's finally given up. I won't speculate whether there was any criminology going on there, but that was a fascinating discussion with Martin Sixsmith, who I can't sadly say goodbye to, who has written the book Suing the Kremlin, The Battle for Putin's Billions, which is available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.com.